going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota, my good friend Danny Abdel-Jabbar, and also Joseph Solis-Mullen. What's up, Joseph? How are you?
I'm good, guys. Thanks for having me. It's always great to talk to you.
Thanks for joining, as usual. So, I just took Danny's line, as usual, or
as per usual.
As per usual.
That's me.
So, we were just, we were basically having the conversation prior to pressing record, so we might as well just fill in everyone of what we're talking about today and why we're having this talk, because you had asked me how did you pick this topic, and I've been doing a lot of research on World War II as of late, and just like the rise of the National Socialists and nationalism in the 1930s in general. And I've been thinking about, what is really right wing and what is really left wing. And there's really it's a difficult thing to really define, because first and foremost, left and right, it's almost subjective at this point. It means something different to almost everyone who engages in politics. But I do think there's real definitions for left-wing and right-wing thought, and there are real traditions that are, part of the zeitgeist. And the other thing, and what really sparks me to want to have this conversation, was just some of the rhetoric behind it, because left and right, people often will just apply, or let me just bring this back. So there's this book called The Big Lie: Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left. And it's by the conservative commentator or analyst author Dinesh D'Souza, who I've had a hard time pronouncing his last name. Dinesh D'Souza. So
just call him Dinesh for the easy.
So he wrote this book, and basically the premise is that the Democrats are the real Nazis. And, basically his thesis is that, left-wing thought is rooted in National Socialism. Hitler was a radical left-winger and all this. And I was just thinking to myself, man, this guy is full of shit. This guy doesn't really know anything, or his framework, his political framework, or his ideological framework is just completely jeopardized by his partisanship, where you can call the National Socialists of Germany a left-wing regime. And I think what really happens is that people take like economics, and at some point in American culture, the left and right was defined by like what you think about social welfare programs. Do you believe in social welfare program and safety nets? Oh, well, then you're a left-winger. Do you believe in the free market? Then you're a right-winger. And somewhere along the lines, I'm not sure exactly when this was. I think it, from my perception, it happened somewhere in the 60s with Goldwater's campaign. But somewhere along the line, the left to right divine was really defined by economics. Well, by that logic, you would have to say like Bismarck's Germany was a left-wing society. And
that's right.
I think of Bismarck's Germany as the most conservative, traditional right-wing society that you can really think of. And Bismarck's Germany is what really pioneered things like pension plans and social welfare and all that type of stuff, all those safety nets that we use today. And that's not a left-wing government at all.
Yeah.
So, Joe, the reason why I wanted to talk to you about it is just because, first and foremost is that, you're extremely, you're incredibly smart, and this history, and the roots of different political traditions. And I really just wanted your take on this. Like, what is the difference between a left-winger and a right-winger? And I think it's valuable to have this conversation, is because I think we all kind of come from different, perspectives. Danny, I don't want to label you, but I think you would agree that you're probably someone who has thought of himself as more of a left-winger for most of his life.
That's right.
I think I've thought of myself as more of somebody who's on the right. And you're kind of like a neutral party in this case, because you're a libertarian. And at the very least, whatever you think about libertarians, they do call balls and strikes when it comes to, partisan politics. So what is your take on the difference between left-wing thought and right-wing thought or tradition? And I know that's kind of a big ask and a big question, but I don't know. You could take this wherever you want.
Well, thanks. I suppose I'll just say as a bit of kind of interesting historical context, the origins of political left and political right, they trace their origins to the French Revolution, to the early days of the French National Assembly, where essentially it was this arbitrary. It was based on who was sitting on which side of the hall, and so you had the on the right hand side you had the essential supporters of the Ancien Regime, or maybe at the most radical end of that spectrum, maybe parliamentary monarchy or something like that. And then on the left side, you had the more social revolutionary radical types. And this evolved into political right and political left as just shorthand umbrella terms for what were always complex and highly differentiated political ideologies. And so that's what I would say to start with. Then the second thing that I would say is it probably makes more sense, if you want to use the terms right and left at all, to talk in terms of kind of a two-dimensional right and left, in the sense that if you can imagine an XY axis, and at the top of the Y-axis you have libertarian, and at the bottom of the Y-axis you have authoritarian, and then on the left-hand side you have things like personal freedom. And then on the x-axis you have personal freedom, and on the y-axis you have economic freedom, and then you can kind of orient yourself that way. So, for example, you might be a very strong believer in personal freedom, or and have very low opinions about economic freedom, right? And so that would pair you one way or another, because I feel like, especially growing up in the 1990s in the United States, there was kind of a merging of within the Republican Party of social conservatives with fiscal conservatives, but that is diverging now in the era of Trump, and you have more calls from right populists to do things that would restrict economic freedom, and so it's arbitrary, and these coalitions are always very fluid. In terms of Dinesh D'Souza and the Nazi Party, Adolf Hitler was rabidly anti-communist. And when it comes to socialism, Otto Strasser was the leader of the socialist aspect of the Nazi Party wing. And his role in the 1920s, he and Hitler were vying for control of the party, essentially, Strasser very much being the number two. But he was the one who brought the socialist aspect to the movement. That was his ideology, and it was a way to reach out to the workers. He loses the fight for control over the Nazi movement and ultimately leaves the party right as the party is coming into power. And of course, Hitler will be placed in power by the conservatives, by those who fear social revolution. And yes, there is state direction of the economy, but that is not to say there was state ownership of the economy. And as Henry rightly pointed out, the existence or non-existence of a social welfare state has very little to do with questions of left or right, except in the sense that in terms of economic freedom, some taxes must be levied. But in the terms of Bismarck's Germany, this was harkening back to a corporate tradition that traced its origins very far back into Central and Eastern European traditions. So obviously, Dinesh D'Souza is either very confused or believes that his audience is historically illiterate. One of the two things: either he doesn't know, or he assumes that they don't know, and so it is politically convenient for him to use the epithet of Nazi. Everyone likes to be able to use that because it automatically discredits your opponent, right? So that's what I would say, I guess, in starting off.
So I want to come back to that access that you're talking about. I believe you're referring to the political compass, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the
yes,
XY
I am.
axis bits.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So I actually encourage listeners to go to like Google for political compass. There's like a website you can go take like a poll, and it'll put you on a quadrant, right? And also one of my favorite subreddits is the Political Compass Memes subreddit, where everyone gets together and makes funny memes about each quadrant, and most of those memes end up shitting on the bottom left-hand corner, the left-wing libertarians. And it's quite funny. But I wonder if we can talk a little bit more about the spectrum, because I agree that I think that this conversation requires a bit more nuance than left and right. You are obviously here introducing a new spectrum, which is the would it be the X or the Y? I forget which one's the one that goes north to south. So
it's the Y.
Yeah. Can we talk about like those specifics there? Because I think that's kind of important for the conversation. So as you pointed out, if you look at the political compass map, and it's helpful because they're also color coded. So we have that on the left to right plane, we have left and right, or as you put it, personal freedom and economic freedom. And then top to bottom, we have authoritarian, and then at the bottom, libertarian, right? And so our top left, that red quadrant, so that'd be left authoritarian. Can you describe a couple of examples of left authoritarian, either politics or countries or pieces of history, just so we can kind of go through the entire compass and talk about examples for each?
Yeah, so the Soviet Union is the archetypal example of left authoritarianism. I'm sure there are some who would quibble with that, but it's generally accepted. So I don't see any reason to reinvent the wheel there. And then if you were to move down and say, left libertarian, as you say, again, that is something like the classic example there is something like the worker cooperatives in Spain, like the Mondragon Corporation. So an entirely worker-owned collective. Because of course there's a great divergence within leftist thought. And it's very interesting to read those debates in the late 19th century among those who were sort of who believed that the state would eventually wither away, versus those who made the state into the total aspect of life, that it was completely totalistic and totalitarian in the very real sense that nothing exists or has any meaning outside of the state. So. And then you have things like, right authoritarian, which would trend more toward Mussolini's Italy, I think is a good example of that. And then right libertarian. No
good examples of libertarians, huh?
right libertarian. No, I struggle to come up with one. I'm sure there must be one. How about, oh gosh, now the name's escaping me. I actually just read about this the other day in a very obscure was in the 1830s. There was this kind of breakaway sort of Christian libertarian group that eventually got absorbed into into New Hampshire. It was part of a border dispute with Canada. I would look it up, but my internet connection is very sketchy, so I don't want to risk upsetting the delicate balance here. But
if I were to offer an option, a contemporary one, I'd argue that someone like a Javier Milei in Argentina, the current president of Argentina, would probably fit pretty firmly in that libertarian right.
Oh, very, very much so. Very much so. Excellent point.
I think I just kind of I see him as just more of a right winger than I guess he's really into libertarian economics. He has like a bracelet that has like Rothbard, Milton Friedman. I forget the other economists he has on his bracelet. But yeah, he's like real into Austrian economics. But
well, so I think that's kind of at the root of the conversation here, right? So we started off our conversation talking about like what's the difference between left wing and right wing, and Joe offered what I thought was a pretty astute nuance here, that it's not just left and right. We're not talking about like France back in the day where they literally divided the room and the people on the left were these people and the people on the right were those people. I think there is this additional access that we have to consider because I think a lot of people, when they talk about left wing and right wing, they're conflating that extra dimension, right? And that's how we get people like Dinesh D'Souza messing up the idea that the left wing in the United States is somehow Nazi because they're also in favor of social programs. And as far as like Argentina's Milei goes, he's definitely a right wing populist, that's for sure. But he's also, as you said, a libertarian in economics because he's kind of a laissez-faire economics guy. So he just kind of lets things go. The free market sorts itself out kind of guy, and that would put him pretty squarely in that camp of right wing and libertarian. So obviously, a lot of people don't want to consider, especially in common discourse, they don't want to consider that extra access. But I think it's so important because, and especially in the United States these days, where we're so politically divided between left and right, but there's so many additional spectrums on there that make things a little complicated.
I frankly think it could. Oh, no. I was actually just going to say rather unhelpfully that I feel like maybe it would be even more helpful, though not necessarily a step towards clarifying things, to add really a third axis to it, because the social freedom or non-freedom axis is really doing a lot of extra work there, because really it should be divided into, social, political, and economic axes.
So like a Z-axis almost? So now we're talking in 3D space?
Yes, it would be very helpful, I think, in that way, to conceptualize these things along each of those individual axes. If we were trying to get a more accurate spatial representation of actual regime types.
Well, I think the easiest way to simplify whether someone is right wing or somebody is left wing, I think, is how much they subscribe to egalitarianism. Do you think that do you believe more in hierarchies and that some people are better than other people just naturally, or do you believe in this kind of egalitarian worldview where everyone is equal? And I think that's the easiest way to really divide it.
Give us a modern context for that. Like how would you place U.S. politics on that egalitarian line?
Right now, U.S. politics? Mm-hmm. I don't know. The U.S. politics is a tricky beast. I think overall, I think the U.S. is pretty center in between left and right. It's like a very centrist country. I think there's been more times, I think over the past, really since FDR though, I think the U.S. has been on a pretty big progressive march forward. There hasn't really been that many moments where I would call the United States a right-wing country, maybe after FDR at the very least.
And is that mostly based on like New Deal politics for you?
I think that's based off New Deal politics and the civil rights movement. I would say that.
Yeah, I think FDR's tenure did a lot to destroy economic freedom in the United States, and then obviously there was a great deal of social legislation in the 1960s. And then from the perspective of civil libertarians, the new century has brought a dystopian edge to the technological possibilities of our lives. We just had the TikTok ban voted on today in Congress. It's just another example of the government increasingly imposing itself on the social and economic spheres. And then on the level of a central bank, because there's this tendency to kind of view the American hesitance to pay taxes, for politicians to vote for tax increases, especially on members of their own party. I remember I had a political science professor who asked me, because I was in school right as Barack Obama was being elected, he asked me, who does Barack Obama want to tax? And, everyone kind of said, the rich people. And he said, no, that he wants to tax Republicans. And it really clicked.
How do you tax a Republican?
Exactly. So the real way that we get taxed is through inflation. That's the real tax. It is a silent tax, but it's a tax nonetheless. And it allows the government to fund itself, fund all of these programs, fund all of these operations that it has going on, and to kick the can down the road in a sense, because these debts will have to be paid eventually by higher taxes or by the printing of more money, which will raise the rate of inflation, which eats into our purchasing power, which will also help, chew away at the value of the national debt. So it's one of the reasons, you should really be opposed to the Federal Reserve, especially if you're someone who is opposed to the American empire and to the welfare state. These things are just not sustainable without the Federal Reserve. You could not get Americans to pay the kind of taxes that would be necessary to sustain these otherwise. The Congressional Budget Office just the other day released a report confirming something that they had said last year, which was that they project the average annual deficit over the next decade to be $2 trillion. It's an annual deficit of $2 trillion.
It's a lot of money.
That's incredible. When it first came out several months ago, I thought, gosh, that can't be right. But there you have it.
So I'm curious about that because I'm admittedly coming from more of a left wing background, but at this juncture, I find a lot of difficulty in labeling myself because I find myself agreeing with policies and ideas from all over the political compass, including on that Z-axis. But so for a normie like me on what I believe you're describing is like a more libertarian policy idea with getting rid of the Fed, can you describe to me why that would be positive for the overall person outside of just the obvious getting rid of a centralized authority that controls inflation? Like, why is that a good thing for a lefty like me?
Well, I guess I would say a couple of things. Number one, you don't necessarily need to get rid of the Federal Reserve. Hayek, a very famous Austrian economist, has a great following in libertarian circles. His recommendation was currency of choice. Get rid of legal tender laws. Force the Fed to compete. I just saw something today that made me chuckle and speaks to this. Elon Musk had retweeted this poster who was making a joke about the US dollar, comparing it to a trash cryptocurrency, uncapped, 27 trillion in circulation, only one node, 1% control 30% of the supply, and it's a great point.
So it's Dogecoin, basically.
It's Dogecoin, yeah. So you need the Fed to compete. You need to force the Fed to compete, and it would also be beneficial for the Fed to be constrained by some sort of standard. Doesn't have to be the gold standard. I'm a huge fan of any kind of commodity money, any kind of asset-backed paper is fine, as long as it's something real that can be measured and that is market determined. That would be better for everyone in the long run. In terms of funding things like social welfare programs, I would just say that, first of all, it's not entirely clear to me that we would have the kinds of systemic poverty and increasing inequality that we have under the Federal Reserve were it not there and were it not allowed to make the decisions that it does. If you look at the Federal Reserve's interventions, they have coincided perfectly with massive rises in inequality. And this is not a surprise, really. Just take a look the other day. Mnuchin, former Treasury Secretary, his group stepped in to buy another troubled lender. This is something going back to 2008. This cheap money, the closer you are to the origin point of that money, the better off you are. And so, of course, Wall Street and the financial economy has become entirely detached from the real economy. And so, if you own an equity portfolio or something like that, you may have been very thrilled by how that was performing over the last year. But if you were also living in the normal world, you might also have noticed that there seems to be a disconnect increasingly between how your portfolio is performing and how your lived experience of the economy is. And again, that's because of distortions in the economy created by the Federal Reserve.
That's an interesting point that you bring up, because I feel comparably. I mean, my investments aren't all that large, but I've been doing well over the last year. But I agree that basic goods and services cost more and more every day, and it seems like we're stretching the dollar. Thankfully, I'm not hurting in a meaningful way like a lot of Americans and people all over the world are. But when I hear this, I immediately think of the recent response to the State of the Union that was given by Katie Britt. Did you guys watch that there?
No, I didn't watch either.
I did.
To be honest.
Well, it was cringe-inducing in my opinion. But one of the I don't know, more stronger points, if I'm being generous to Katie Britt here. One of the stronger points she was making is trying to make a comparison to the economic realities of Americans today, and how that's not reflected in the way that President Biden and his administration talks about the accomplishments that they are touting economically. Does this have something to do with what you were describing, Joe, in terms of that disconnect between, the portfolio's doing well, but the everyday not so much? And how does this relate to our initial conversation about questions of left and right, where it seems like the right is trying to beat down the left on an economic stance in that respect?
Right. So Republicans are attacking the Biden administration's use of headline statistics. For example, jobs numbers, which, first of all, I think it's worth pointing out that the unemployment rate has remained historically low for a number of reasons, one of which was forecast. The first time I read about it was back in 2012. It was just in an economics journal article that I was reading for school, where they basically said, look, we're going to have a massive amount of generational turnover starting around 2020, where there's just going to be a ton of baby boomers retiring and leaving the job force. And so there's going to be a very, very high demand for jobs. Like there's just not going to be a lot of slack in the labor market. And so those two things coincided. Number two, the cost of living has gone up so much, and especially people on fixed incomes have had to go back into the labor force. The other thing that I would say about the equities, just today the Wall Street Journal released article. I read the corporate press every day. One of its headline articles today was about how the average cyclically adjusted price to earnings ratio of the market right now is 34. That means the market average is trading at 34 times its forward earnings. So that is in the 1%. That is in the top 1% of all-time readings, all-time measurements of the market. It is trading at a very huge premium right now. There are several reasons for that. One is the market is already pricing in several rate cuts. They're anticipating a return to easy money. Now, back in November, the Federal Reserve tipped their hand and said, yes, we anticipate 6 rate cuts next year. And so the market started zooming again at all of these very risky, long, far out in the future return investments going zoom, right? Because the expected value today is going down. So it makes it easier to justify a return like that in the future, or a hypothetical return like that in the future. So they're banking on the Federal Reserve cutting rates multiple times. It's a question to me whether or not that is actually going to happen. Inflation has been coming in increasingly higher than the Fed wants. Jerome Powell, a couple of weeks ago with the last reading, there was another reading recently that was also not going in the right direction. But Powell had said, we don't need to see different numbers. We just need to keep seeing the same numbers to confirm that it's going lower. But the truth is it's not going lower anymore. It hasn't been going lower for several months now. And inflation may be entrenched at a level higher than what the Fed wants. And it may sound like 2%, 3.5%. That's a massive difference. Like in terms of, percentage wise, that's a massive difference, over 30% higher than what the Fed wants to see. And it's not clear to me whether or not Jerome Powell will just bite the bullet and say, well, we're just going to cut rates anyway because, banks' bond portfolios are under so much stress. Prices move inversely to yields. There's lots of banks that are very underwater on their bond portfolios, and that they need rates to get cut to fix that situation. But they run the risk then of inflation really taking off and getting out of hand. This is what happened in the 1970s. The Nixon administration leaned very hard on Arthur Burns, who was very weak-kneed, easily pushed around chairman of the Federal Reserve, exactly the kind of guy Nixon wanted as a Federal Reserve chairman. He cut rates to help Nixon politically and took his foot off the brake there and allowed inflation to really get completely out of hand. And so we could see that same thing happening here. So where does this go with economic freedom? Well, number one, I would say that high periods of inflation are not good for society. They're going to make the poorest worse off. Their money is not going to go as far. They're the ones who are living paycheck to paycheck. And there are a tragically great number of people. So inflation is very bad for them. There are actually huge benefits to the very wealthy, because the very wealthy are often the ones that are hugely, hugely in debt, right? The idea that the wealthy are the ones who don't have any debt is completely wrong. They have tons of debt usually, and high levels of inflation help them pay it off quicker with less valuable dollars. So high levels of inflation will widen the already significant wealth gap in this country. It makes the politics much more radicalized, much more divided. And again, this goes back to the difficulties that people are facing. The more threatened people feel in their livelihoods, the less secure they feel, the more they lash out, the easier it is to play the divisive political card. It's one of the reasons the Republicans want to play the card so badly, even though their policies, aren't going to do anything to help. They love spending money just as much as Democrats do. They actually add more special projects to spending bills that they try and then vote against than anyone else. It's completely ridiculous. It's just an issue they like to campaign on because it sounds nice. They're not offering any remedies. So yeah, I guess that's what I'd say. Inflation is very bad for any kind of freedom, economic freedom, social freedom, political freedom. It all leads in the other direction. And
So given that inflation, it appears the root cause of inflation seems to be coming from the Federal Reserve, which is ostensibly an independent third party, despite having the word federal in it, and with the exception that you pointed out of kind of weak-kneed chairman of the Federal Reserves being pushed around by presidents. Like, it seems to me that this problem crosses left and right wing quite easily, but in the modern discourse today, it seems like, depending on who's in power, or depending on who you ask for that matter, we're always going to lobby that bag, kind of toss the hot potato from left to right, and that, with even my basic understanding of the issues at hand, it seems like it seems like a stupid argument to have, right? It's neither a left or a right wing issue in that respect. What could we do about that in the national discourse to separate that kind of economic issue that seems to be pervasive across, both sides of the aisle, so to speak, but nevertheless is used as a campaigning, point for both sides? What do we do about that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the incentives are all the other way. If only politics was just a question of figuring out what the right thing to do was. Right. That was one of the really disheartening things for me, because I was my initial studies and graduate work was in political science, and working campaigns and things like that as was part of that, and it was just so oh man, it was such a cynical experience, very disheartening, because it is just a question of poll numbers and perception and spin, and how can we use this? I'll give you a great example. Just recently, the border. Everyone's saying we need to do something. Senate finally gets a bill done. Everyone says, "Oh, great, we did it." Trump comes out that evening and puts something out on social media saying, "No, don't pass this bill. That might help the border, and we want to campaign on that issue." And the very next day, all these same senators who were Republicans who had said, "Great, we did it," were saying, "This bill is a disaster. Can't vote for it. Horrible disaster." It's just overnight. It was just as clear as could be. I mean, it is really about power. And I think that tells us, number one, that the state has too much power. The fact that it is such a desperate battle over who's going to be president, and it matters so much, that tells you right there that the president has maybe too much power. The fact that Congress does such a bad job, gets to kick the can down the road. I mean, have to force Congress to start legislating. People complain about, out of control justices legislating from the bench. Well, that's because Congress won't take up any difficult questions. People complain about the president, too many executive orders. It's because Congress isn't doing its job. Congress won't legislate. And that's, again, it's easier to just go back to your constituencies and say what they want to hear, rather than saying, look, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to make some deals. I'm going to try and move the ball forward. We're not going to get everything we want out of every single bill. Just going to try and compromise and make deals. You're going to get primaried right out of existence. There are very few purple districts anymore, very few purple states. It's a very tough situation politically, very, very tough. It's hard to see optimistic things in the future.
Well, just going back to what you were saying about increased political radicalization, especially in terms of right and left, what you're seeing with the American right, you see this general trend of the primary base of the American right being whites who are going through downward mobility. So whites that are getting poorer. And then you see the left wing or the liberal Democrats, one of their primary bases is our whites who have degrees, who have advanced degrees. So you're seeing, it's like that perception of, 20 years ago, or when I was a kid, the perception was that, okay, like if you're family, if you're a working class family, if your dad's in a labor union, then you're a Democrat because the Democrats are for the laborers. And if you're like family is like a banking family, or your dad's a CEO of a company, then they're a Republican, obviously, because like, the Republican Party is for the poor. That was just kind of like the simplified messaging. But now you're seeing a lot of the Republican base is more so catering towards people who are moving downward in the class system. And that conversation about economics, I think is going to be, is going to become less and less relevant. Today, I don't spend that much time, watching like, most political commentary or most mainstream political commentary, but I'll every once in a while I'll see like a viral clip, and there was a clip of Ben Shapiro, and Ben Shapiro is probably the most famous conservative commentator in the world right now, or at least one of them. There was a clip of him saying, complaining about not wanting to raise the retirement age, and he was saying, you shouldn't be expected to work until, you're 70. Actually, I'm of the opinion that you should never there should be no retirement age. Like, why is that? And, he was being shit on, and he was being shit on by a lot of right wingers. Like what are you talking about? And that was a talking point. That was like an old Mark Levine type talking point that came from like the Reagan age. Like it was like a Reaganite talking point. And it was seen to be rejected by the majority of, people of the right. So you're seeing more right wingers kind of leave that tradition of like more free market type stuff, more, less social welfare, and adopt more, economic interventionist economic policy. And I think that trend is going to continue. Unfortunately, I don't think there's going to be this libertarian emergence that happens in the American right. I think that the future for the American right is probably going to be more of it's going to demand more economic authoritarianism, more measures to release certain pain points, rather than pro business, pro free market, cutting welfare type programs. That's the general trend I see. The American right today is in just looking at the American tradition of the right. I don't even really know where that tradition begins. I think the earliest place that you can really identify it were the people who were opposed to FDR. Like I really think the modern day American right starts in the 1930s with the they were sort of like political gadflies in a sense, the people who opposed FDR's New Deal program, because there was a rather big opposition to FDR's New Deal, and I'm talking about people like Garrett and I was going to say John C. Reilly, not John C. Reilly, John O'Neill. A lot of these guys who emerged who were totally against FDR and everything that he did. As you know, that wing of the right wing, or that they were all basically eliminated with the rise of the National Review. They were all pushed out of the movement. And these guys really made their fame, writing for different magazines and publications because, before the internet, magazines had a lot more prestige. Like if you wrote for some big magazine and you were a pretty famous political commentator, well, all those guys were pushed out of the movement because they weren't as keen on. They were ardent anti-communist, but they weren't down with the new right's priority of creating a massive government to fight the Cold War. They were also against they also had very hard feelings about the United States siding with the Soviet Union and supporting Mao and supporting different communists, during World War II. These guys, that tradition really died off. And now people are saying there's like this emergence of paleoconservatism or there's a direct lineage of, between the right wing now and the old right of from the 1930s. I don't really see that much of a connection other than this new right wing is a little less keen on military intervention, but I don't really think that's real. I think, if let's just say if Trump's elected and if he wanted to go to war with Iran, there really wouldn't be too much resistance from the American right, or at least the leaders of the American right. I know that was kind of a ramble, but I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are, I guess, on the general premise of the right wing demographic kind of slowly eroding from relevance.
I mean, I could jump in there if you don't mind. I think I agree with you, Henry, on all those points. I think a similar conclusion can be said for the left. I mean, we've done episodes here on the past, specifically talking about like McCarthyism and how, very left-wing ideologies and socialism just straight up doesn't exist in this country either. And, for a lot of people that, wanted more socialist policies here in the United States, they were persecuted out of existence, right? And while you do see a moderate trend upwards, like especially around like the Bernie crowd or the Squad, people like that, those are cute little echoes of true left-wing policies, but in truth, there is not a strong left wing, and in which case,
my question is, and this brings us back to the original point, like what is left wing and what is right wing?
Right.
Was Bernie's campaign? Let's just say if Bernie Madoff. When you have a young baby and you're sleep deprived, you make errors like this. Let's just say if Bernie Sanders, he kept all the same economic policies, like every single economic policy, all of his taxation plans, everything were exactly the same. But let's just say he was a hardcore immigration hawk and a hardcore American nationalist.
Yeah,
and
that'd be interesting.
So what if he had that combination?
Well, that would make him a Nazi, he was, like literally.
What would he be considered? Would he still be a left winger, or would he be a right winger?
I think that makes him, like by definition, a national socialist, right? Because that's basically what
But I don't know. I don't know if that makes him a national. So that's kind of
it doesn't make him a Nazi in the pejorative term. It makes him a Nazi in the definition of national socialists, right? Because the national socialists were very nationalistic, very anti-immigration, very socially conservative in on those fronts. However, at the same time, to stave off and create an alternative to communism and Bolshevism specifically, they had to generate a lot of these social welfare programs, a lot more of them than they already had, frankly, to kind of placate the masses. And of course, this was very limited to only German citizens and, white Aryans. And then there's all these, race issues that kind of come into play there. But if there was a Bernie that was for, $20 an hour minimum wage and, all of the things that he campaigned on, but at the same time was kind of like an immigration hawk, that kind of makes him exactly a National Socialist, not a Nazi, not in the pejorative sense, but quite literally, that's how they were made up. Correct me if I'm wrong here.
One thing that stood out to me when Henry was talking there, which I do agree, the whole idea of the National Socialist versus the International Socialist, the whole idea that building socialism in the individual countries versus those socialists who believed that the goal was to unify, all the workers of the world, and eventually the states would all, disintegrate and become irrelevant. One thing that stood out to me as Henry was talking, I've just been pondering it, is sort of the change in rhetoric and the change in the constituent makeup of voting blocks. Just give you one example. Tucker Carlson is a very prominent figure on the American conservative circles, right? Republicans, that is. And he'll say things like, what about taking care of the people of this country? This is not a talking point. You heard it a little bit with the George W. Bush campaign. They tried to pitch something called compassionate conservatism, but this was very much swatted away in favor of more tax cuts. There was a debate back in 2004, 2005, right around that period, where there was a brief attempt to try and brand him as a quote-unquote compassionate conservative. But really, that whole rhetoric is very new to republicanism. It's very populist. Henry has exactly right. Republican discourse on social issues was social inequality, for example, was really non-existent. It was pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You're not working hard enough. What do you need handouts for? Things of that nature. One thing that I would say about the Republican electorate is that it's actually, at least according to polls over the last 5-6 years, it seems to be getting browner in some sense. And I think that this has to do with social issues, because in the same way that Republicans have to cater to their primary electorate, who are very traditional in their view of the family, so too do Democrats have to cater to their primary electorate, which in large urban areas can often consist of the highly educated professionals who come from university settings, who have very different ideas about what the family structure should look like, what is socially acceptable, etc. And Hispanic voters, first and second generation Hispanic voters, tend very much to be more aligned to Republican traditional family structure values. And so this has led to the Democrats bleeding Hispanic voters in particular over the last couple of election cycles. So I find that to be a rather... Yes. And so it's an interesting shift because, again, I don't know that it's their natural constituency. Ronald Reagan was very convinced all the way back in the 80s that Hispanics coming from south of the border there were natural Republicans. They just didn't know it yet, I think is how he phrased it. So I find it interesting that the Democrats have been pulled left, actually have been pulled leftward on social questions very quickly. I mean, we're barely a decade from the legalization of same-sex marriage, the Supreme Court ruling there. I mean, back in the 90s, which, gosh, when was the Defense of Marriage Act? When did Clinton sign that? The late 90s? So it's been a very quick move to the left on social questions. In terms of the Democrats' moves And I feel like, yes, it has alienated a lot of working class voters. I thought it was really a question whether the UAW would give Biden their endorsement, because so many UAW members say that they are pro-Trump. And Trump, as Henry said, the future of the Republican Party looks to be much more protectionist, much more interventionist in the economy. So I wonder whether or not we might not see a realignment there over the next decade.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely it looks like it's trending that way. I guess in terms of the American left, man, I don't even really know what to say about the American left at this point. The narrative, I know more about the right wing, so I talk more about the right wing just because I come from that heritage. But the way that I see it, the left wing is almost, I guess, real populist left wing. So the left wing in America basically is just a coalition of like educated university types, like you said, with master's degrees, and then largely, no offense, but people who depend on the welfare state, largely poor minorities, and that's the coalition. The right wing coalition is the majority of whites who are kind of caught in this economic downfall pit, and these left wingers, I don't really think they give a shit about economic issues, unless they are at the bottom. And of course, like, if you're poor and living in the projects, you're going to vote for more welfare programs. You're going to vote for things that are immediate in your interest. And if some Republican came down to me and was like, hey, pull yourself by your bootstraps. You don't need those food stamps or welfare benefits. Like, you don't need Section 8 housing. We're going to raise, like, the rent should be raised here. Don't you get it? Like, if the housing was privatized, then the free market would naturally make the price go down. Like, if you start having those conversations, people are going to be like, no, I'm just going to continue voting for my benefits. Same thing with like minimum wage. Going to somebody who makes $9 an hour and saying, the reason why you make $9 an hour is because that's what your labor is worth. If you got a better job or just did more job training, then you'll be making $20 an hour if your employer sees that you're worth it. No, I'm just going to vote for a $20 minimum wage. That seems like a better solution. So I understand why you would vote for those policies, because it's directly going to impact. It's directly going to benefit you. And like telling, let's just say if you're a 55-year-old cashier at like a local dollar store, and you have, you're struggling, you have a couple different, you have healthcare problems, you can't afford a doctor, you are, you rent, you get, you're constantly getting shafted by your landlord. Of course, you're going to vote and join a coalition to people who are going to offer you some type of relief. Like, that's just like the natural, solution to vote in your interest. And if someone is going to come out and say, yeah, we're going to make things more fair, then, why wouldn't you vote that? Why wouldn't you vote that way? Like, why wouldn't you be voting for every single Democrat who promised you that sort of relief?
I think to your point though, Henry, that there's a whole group of white voters who are on the economic downturn, who by that logic ought to vote for left-wing politicians. Nevertheless, we see people vote their party line. So I don't necessarily think that argument holds a whole lot of water, right? People vote against their interests all the time. Sometimes it's just out of habit. Sometimes it's out of, political pandering. Sometimes it's, because, our two-party system sets up a straw man argument for literally every policy issue that there is, and then some. I don't particularly agree. As the token lefty on the pod today, I think I'll stand pretty firm and say that there is no true left. I always chuckle a little bit when right wingers or pundits of right wingers, try to paint the idea that the prominent left wing politicians in government are actually communists or trying to do communism in America, because it's so far from the truth. You'll have your handful of folks that might pioneer some socialist ideas, but those things don't get done. And to Joe's earlier point, Congress doesn't legislate at all. So, there's a huge difference between what people say and what they actually do. And that goes for the legislators who say and campaign on specific policy initiatives on both right and left sides of the aisle, but also on voters themselves who say that they're in favor of specific things, but might vote a completely different way. I just don't think it's that cut and dry, which makes our whole conversation here super complicated, right? Why wouldn't that disaffected white voter who's a lifelong Republican want to vote for someone like Bernie Sanders, who's offering them what you would describe as like the easy route, right? Here's $20 an hour,
or just immediate relief. That's what I'm saying. Like someone who's offering you immediate relief.
Correct.
Like no one's going to be thinking about the big picture. So I'm of the opinion that in the long run, for most Americans, a more free market economic, like Austrian economics would do the most benefit for the most amount of people. Okay, but if that means ripping away somebody's Medicaid that they depend on, no, like that's, I mean, how, like, no, like I would say no. All right, I don't really care about the big picture. Like I don't care if this is going to be lead to a more prosperous society 20 years down the road, or what, maybe not that long, 10 years down the road. I care about the social services that you're ripping away from me because I need those. I depend on them.
Social services aside, Henry, I think I want to, and I'd love to get Joe's opinion on this here, because Henry, you pointed out an example that was wild, which is like, you shouldn't get Section 8 housing because, we should raise the rent or whatever. That rant that you went on, I'm paraphrasing it and doing it really poorly.
Or privatize
Exactly,
housing.
Privatizing housing.
If there was more
right?
competition in the housing market, then, there naturally rent prices would go down.
But we see quite the opposite in reality, right? There are mega corporations that are currently buying up every single property on the market, which is inflating the costs of entry-level homes for people to buy. And since we're now in a basically what's turning into an entirely renter's economy, those prices are crazy high. I actually just personally went through this, helping my mom find a new apartment to live in, and things are incredibly expensive because the market's so widely priced out. Another one is I live in Puerto Rico, and a big, economic incentive is here to purchase property, make an Airbnb, make some passive income, right? And we get a lot of these corporations that are buying up a lot of the homes, making it, quite unaffordable for regular Puerto Ricans, let alone, fortunate, mainlanders who transplanted myself here, have a bit of a struggle to find places that are reasonably priced that we can do. I don't think that the privatization of that particular market has proven to make us better off in that respect. And the existence of Section 8 almost seems like a necessary evil, if it is an evil at all, because it's like impossible due to the privatization of the housing market to actually acquire a home. Joe, what's your thoughts on that, being resident libertarian on the pod today?
Sure. On one hand, it's very natural for people to vote for someone who is going to promise them a quick and immediate solution. Speaking to the idea that people vote against their interest, and I often think this sometimes when I see a vote coming, and Republicans will really be pushing hard against it, but at the same time, they'll be adding tons of little pet projects for their district to it, you know? And just like we're going to repeal Obamacare. We're going to do it. We're going to do it. When the time came, they didn't actually want to do it, right? Their constituents count on that. Their constituents told them, don't you do that. Don't cut Medicare. Don't cut Medicaid. Don't privatize my Social Security. So it's more of just a nice thing to be able to campaign on. But at the end of the day, I feel like a lot of these times Republicans don't actually want these bills to go down in flames. They want them to get passed. These continuing resolutions to just spend tons of money. The Fed will print it and, some other Congress down the road will have to deal with the consequences of it. There is every incentive short term to just do what is expedient. It is just one of the aspects of our system that is proving increasingly problematic. In terms of the specifics of rent, in the housing market generally, the picture is complicated and it's highly localized. Housing prices, they speak about them in averages and in aggregate, but really there are different pockets, right? Real estate markets are local. And so there are some real estate markets that are doing very, very rough. There was a bank in New York that just went under the other day that had to be rescued in part by Mnuchin's group. And when I was looking at over their turnaround plan and whatnot, one of the things that stood out to me is a lot of the real estate that this company owns is in rent controlled housing areas. And oh my goodness, you don't want that. There's also legislation that constricts supply. It's not as though you can just roll up and start building new housing and new apartments and stuff. The red tape in a lot of these places is very difficult to get through. And it's because, large real estate owners in these areas are lobbying to keep other builders out. It helps keep the rents high. I will just say this about the idea that, institutional investors are buying up all the houses and driving up the prices. That is just, again, that's a common misconception. Yes, they are buying single family housing, but I mean, we're talking on the order of like 2% of the housing stock in the country. This was a level that it reached back in 2012, for example, right? And people weren't priced out of the market in 2012. There are other things that are going on inside the housing market, which are leading to these skyrocketing price dynamics in various pockets of the country. So that's not to say that the rent is not, unsustainably high for some people, or that they wouldn't vote for, people who promise them rent control. It's just to say that, it's a complex situation and not one that lends itself well. The subtleties of the conversation do not lend itself well to sound bites, right? It's much easier to just, pick a thing and blame it. And, like that Medium article that came out, a couple months ago that people in Congress were bringing up that said, 44% of all houses are bought by BlackRock or something, which was like not even close. It wasn't even close to being accurate or true. And yet you had people bringing it up on the floor of the House. Not that facts ever stop them from doing anything. The TikTok debate was hilarious. A tragic example.
I'll concede on your point that it is a highly localized issue, and I'd also argue that 2% number is also localized, right? So there are going to be areas where that number is higher, and areas where that number is lower. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, it seems like the major urban centers, which is where the majority of our populations are currently centered, those numbers tend to be a bit higher than in, say, the more rural, less populous areas. I think that's
absolutely
pretty much everywhere.
Absolutely, and that's the difficult thing is talking about these things. It takes subtlety, it takes time, and the solutions are often difficult to see because it requires so many different interests being aligned. For one thing, the housing stock just needs to expand. There's just no reason that it shouldn't, except for the fact that there are people who do not want housing stock to increase in certain areas. Mm-hmm. And so it's very difficult. It can be frustrating.
Do you know how much like the average house, like 1,500 square foot house is in Long Island? Like, wait, just take a guess.
$750,000.
Around that, probably around 700K.
Oh my heavens!
For the average 50. So like we're talking about small, 3-bedroom houses, 1 bathroom.
It's comparable in San Juan, actually.
These houses are $700,000. You can find a house that needs a shit ton of work for $600,000, but you're not going to find anything under $600,000. The price of my house since I bought it has gone up $60,000 in its estimate. The price of housing for people who are like graduating from school and people who are trying to start families, and I only anticipate this getting way worse at the very least where I live. I don't know how people are going to do it. I don't know how people are going to be buying houses in the future. And there is this, what politicians like to really run on is the stock market. And they'll point to, so the S&P 500 ETF trust was at, what's that, 515 right now? That's
actually, I just looked at the data on the Fred economic data, and Q4, the median sale price of houses sold in the United States is $417,000. But even that is just like a bridge too far for so many people.
Yeah, it absolutely is. So the S&P 500 ETF trust is at 515. That's the highest it's ever been, right? It's never been, because only a couple of months ago it was like 420 or 430. So before COVID, it was at like 3. I'm looking at the chart right now. So it was at 333 right before COVID. It dropped down to 253, and since November, it was 427, and now it's 515. So this is a product of investors forecasting that there's going to be quantitative easing cycles, or like just more money printed. What is this rapid increase in the value of stocks?
Yeah, that is definitely pricing in, and you can go to CME futures and you can look and see how market participants are positioning themselves. Like they are pricing in multiple cuts. The Federal Reserve is just insanely powerful. I mean, it is the monopolist of the world reserve currency. Like, everything is priced based on treasury prices. Like, that is the quote unquote risk-free asset that every single financial modeler uses as their baseline asset. There are institutions who literally must bid on treasuries when they come up for auction. I mean, it's quite a system that's set up here, and it is immensely powerful. And so, you look at the typical statistics that, people like Markowitz or someone would have used back in the day to say, well, I mean, you're trading at 34 times your earnings. I mean, that's a terrible return. It's obviously overpriced. That's not what people are looking at. People are looking at, how much how much are bonds going to yield, and we've had a real yield famine over the last 15, 20 years. The Fed has been artificially suppressing bond yields, and this distortion of the bond market has caused equity prices to skyrocket. It's caused home prices to skyrocket. One other thing that you had there, there were unusual price pressures in the home market there, because right at the same time you had the Federal Reserve turning on the money printer during COVID, you also had tons of people trying to get out of the cities and pushing up home prices, right? So like there were some unusual demand dynamics going on there. But like these prices are going to be entrenched permanently higher, more than likely. There's not going to be a dramatic collapse in home prices likely like there was in 2008, which even that was very temporary. And that was because of the way that certain securitized mortgage-backed products were being held and traded. Which is just not, it's not the same. There are still these there are still these products being traded around, but the way that they're structured and the way the Federal Reserve manages its credit facilities, like you're just not going to have something like that happen. So it's really a question for me, which you mentioned, how are people going to afford houses in the future if we continue on this trajectory? And the answer is I just don't think they will be able to in a lot of places. And so what is that going to do to our politics and society?
Well, how can people even, like, if you're young, or if you don't really have any money or enough money, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, like how do you even start an investment portfolio?
Yeah, there's a phenomenon.
If you're in the stock market,
yeah, go ahead.
I mean, if you've been in the stock market, I mean, you're kind of coasting right now. But if you don't, let's just say if you have $3,000 to your name, and what you're doing is you're paying your that money goes towards rent and your necessities to live. Like, how do you even start an investment portfolio realistically? Like, you're almost like priced out of you're not only your ability to buy a house, but your ability to create like passive income streams.
Well, I will just say this. Number one, there's been a rise in the ability to buy partial shares of things. Like when I first started buying equities and stuff, you couldn't do that. But now you can buy like part of a share of an S&P index fund, and you can set that to be a recurring purchase. Like maybe you want to buy $100 every couple weeks or something like that. And so you can grow that into a portfolio over time. I would also say I just posted something in the chat here because yes, equity prices look like they're going parabolic, and they are. But when you look at them from a wider angle view, global GDP has been going parabolic, over the last century and a half. And there is a question of whether or not a major innovation in something like general AI or something like that is going to provide the same kind of continued growth that the first and second industrial revolutions provided the global economy. So, and there are people making bets like that. Like money is pouring into AI. Now some of this is of
Chip
course
makers
speculative.
Mm-hmm.
Chip makers, Nvidia's blowout earnings, which really powered the economy forward. Again, though, some of that buying is speculative. You have companies like Microsoft who are buying tons and tons of chips on the assumption that we're going to need these eventually. Well, what happens if this winds up being, a bust? There was a Tronics bust back in the 60s with the Nifty 50, which was kind of similar, just people just getting out ahead of themselves. But of course, what is
Tronics? I'm not familiar with this. What is that?
If you look up like the electronics boom, like there was just kind of a bubble that happened in the late 1960s there as people started piling into stocks in like new electronic gadgets. But again, if you bailed when that started falling and then you never got back in, like you totally missed out. Just look at the S&P 500's growth over the last 70 years. Like bubbles happen. I happen to be a pretty firm believer in just index funds in the efficient market hypothesis. I don't think there is a point in trying to expend energy trying to find alpha plays. I think that just putting money into equities, putting money into bonds, like over the long term, you'll be just fine. Obviously that people enjoy the speculative aspects of that, trying to get rich quick, that type of thing. But
everyone wants to find that stock and be like, "Oh, but I invested in it. I invested when they first went public, and now look at me." Like everyone wants to be that guy.
It's exciting. That's why. But losing money is not so exciting.
But it's like, man, most people who speculate on the stock, most amateurs that speculate on the stock market, they lose money. Like they're not pros. They don't actually have a strategy, and they end up getting fucked.
I'll dip my toe into that speculation though, because something that Joe said really obviously woke me up very, very much, and it's the AI bit. I don't think it's speculative to assume that AI is going to turn into an industrial revolution. That the genie's out of the bottle already. And the advancements made in that field have been extraordinary. And I think this relates really nicely with the overarching conversation we're having about left and right and some of the shifts in policies and in thinking. Because pretty soon, undoubtedly, in my opinion, there's going to be a major movement and loss of jobs due to AI doing a better job at many, many things, and it's coming for everyone. So at a certain juncture, I think a lot of political thought is going to start moving to the left and start being more protective over, regular human beings, because it would be a necessity. Very soon, the value of labor is going to go down for a lot of industries, and this is many industries are gonna face this question. If the robot can do it faster and better, if the AI in the computer can do it faster and better than the human beings, what's the point of the human beings?
Yes, and it's curious too, because this is similar to the arguments that were being had over the automation of factories, which was, should we protect the jobs? Should we not? Should we allow these advancements to happen? Do we not? It's obviously a choice to some degree. Creative destruction. Joseph Schumpeter, just to bring another Austrian into it, he said this is the essential aspect of capitalism, and it's something that no one is perfectly comfortable with, because there is a fundamental uncertainty. And when it comes to AI, I do wonder how much people are going to be willing to let this just play out, because of some of the very drastic consequences that it could have on a number of levels. And then the other thing that I wonder about too is the sort of essential further hollowing out of the economy potentially. For example, if all of these people are being displaced from jobs and they're just, massive job loss. What is going to stimulate the economy? 60% of the economy is consumer spending. So it's just a question to me of, if all these people are losing jobs because people are using AI to do these jobs, what is keeping the economy moving forward? Who's buying all these products that are being made by the AI? It's just not clear to me. And I don't think it's clear to anyone.
That's where the socialism argument comes in, right? That the idea that you'd need to then redistribute some of the profits, let's call it that, for lack of a better term, to support the populace such that they can indeed provide the economic stimulus, right? To do the spending, to buy the products that are made. Otherwise,
tax the
whole
corporations,
system,
tax the corporations who are employing the AI then?
Correct, right? Like, I've heard of technology taxes, or some people have been floating AI taxes, for these corporations that are employing at large scales the use of artificial intelligence, and soon, whenever it comes out, artificial generalized intelligence. It's going to be an almost like a necessary evil in that juncture. Otherwise, the whole thing collapses, right? There's incentives on both sides, both from the corporation side and from the consumer side, for this to trend in that direction. You're not making AI go away. I just don't think that's a thing. It would be like saying, hey, we're going to get rid of factories because, it's displacing workers, right? That didn't happen when the Industrial Revolution came around. So if history tells us anything, we're going to go full steam ahead with AI. It's going to displace millions and millions of workers, specifically lower skilled ones. But even some of the higher skilled ones with artificial intelligence are out of the bag. I mean, content creators, researchers. I'm reading how it's passing bars and finding novel gene sequences and all kinds of things that it would be completely unimaginable. Think about like arts. It's making music and movies and scripts and everything. So the natural progression here is that you need to protect the human beings. And how do you do that?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, it's just funny you mentioned passing the bar. That was one of the first job things that I thought of is just because my wife is a lawyer, and so I'm familiar with the intricacies of that profession. They are like highly protective. Like it's the actual bar association in each state that decides who's going to. Right. You can't just show up and So I just wonder whether or not there won't be more protective associations that form like that to try and keep AI out of their job industry. And you know what I mean?
The question just becomes for how long, right? For how long?
Yeah,
I mean, I think about from a law perspective, we have a crisis at the border where you have a backlog of 6 years worth of immigration cases. And it creates a whole incentive. Creates a whole incentive for people to come here because it takes a freaking long time for you to get your hearing and ultimately be deported if they even find you at that juncture. So, what if we employed AI to handle those cases, right? I mean, I'm talking about the technology that we have today could probably process all of them in a matter of days,
Yeah.
Of course, you'd want some human being on the back end to, verify the work and make sure it's not hallucinating and things like that, because the technology is not quite there yet, but it will be. And that's a guarantee. It will be. So maybe there will be bar associations that resist the AI, but for how long?
Yeah, I don't know. It's just a thought that occurred to me as far as, people are going to want protection from it. And that's not really political protection. That's professional protection. I guess I'm not entirely sure how they gained that status. I'm guessing it had to be some sort of legislative act.
Well, we spoke briefly about kind of UAW, right? And we were talking about how generally that they were more on the conservative side, but you were kind of surprised to see them, offer the endorsement to Biden. UAW and many other unions and things like that were kind of sprung out of that industrial revolution as a direct protection for the people, right? Because they wanted to guarantee, economic prosperity for the human beings in the face of, automation and industrial automation in that case, and in this case, digital automation, from eviscerating people's jobs and livelihoods. So I imagine that we would do the same thing. We would create wider unionization, and unionization is typically like a left-wing thing bordering onto communism here, right? So,
well, it gets back to that political spectrum, because of course you had things like corporate bodies, corporate rights, which is what Bismarck was hearkening back to when he created the welfare state in Germany. So you could have corporate bodies and unions that had a socially conservative bent, some that were, politically, authoritarian. And I think of, sort of the modern conservative, small c, conservative, Republican movement in the United States. I increasingly see them as just being willing to kind of give themselves up to any great leader who promises to protect them from these forces that are changing the world. Sort of a Bonapartist kind of urge. Bonapartism in sort of the Marxist dialectical sort of way. And so I think the real danger is that these changes are not addressed, and that Congress, for example, simply keeps neglecting to do its job, and things just continue to get worse, because it makes other solutions seem at least worth trying. The political discourse today that you hear that passes for perfectly normal, maybe a little eyebrow raising, but certainly well within the bounds of normal, is stuff that was totally unthinkable that you'd hear 20 years ago, 15 years ago even. And so I think there have been a lot of opportunities to avoid the situation that we're sliding into now, are fully into now. And at the end of the day, I just wish that there were more competent options available, and that there were less bad incentives baked into the system. Because, as you said, these are very serious questions that could affect the livelihoods of many, many people. And the fact that it's really just a short-term battle for political advantage in most cases is not going to do us any favors in trying to deal with something as socially disruptive as generalized artificial intelligence, which of course is going to have all sorts of impacts on the economy and politics. And it has so much promise, to better our lives. But unfortunately, it has just as much ability to destroy things. It is a tool after all. So it has no teleology. It's about how we're going to use it.
None whatsoever.
So,
does a nuclear device have a teleology inherently?
I don't
that's
know.
a tool, technically.
Yeah, well, I think the nuclear power, gosh, you want us to stop burning, fossil fuels and stuff. I'm aware of the dangers of nuclear power, but my goodness, well, what else are we going to use? And I look
I'm
at
banking on fusion myself, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, there are so many things that we could be putting the brain power of society towards, and gosh, instead we're musing about making killer swarms of drones to autonomously target our enemies and stuff. And gosh, it just seems like such a tragedy that we've reached the cusp of such a technological state that but our leaders and the geopolitics increasingly resemble like the 19th century.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean. The idea that we were going to see national borders disappear, and I was just writing an article several months ago about sort of the techno-utopianism of the 1990s, and just reading some of the things that were being published in mainstream journals about how the state is irrelevant, and the future is all going to be dynamism and open borders, and it's very sad to see the turn that we've increasingly taken. We're going back to a place that we don't want to go.
Yeah, man.
So,
and I know you as a father, I think about like what my children are going to be growing up in all the time. Like what is society going to look like in 20 years? And man, like I just don't see it. Everything is pointing towards like catastrophe. to be dramatic, man. Like I don't think that we're dealing with these problems in a productive way, and I think the politics that are going to emerge globally are going to be pretty they could potentially be very toxic. Like if we think the politics now are toxic, I think the politics in 20 years could be a lot worse, especially if inequality continues to increase the way it is. Because there's pockets of this population, man, that I feel like they're locked out of a lot of things, and it seems like in the future there's going to be more people who are going to be pushed out of the ability to be productive members of society. And you have to think, what are these people going to do? Like if there's like mass unemployment due to API, API, AI. What are these unemployed people going to do? Are they going to put their energy into some sort of new political system that benefits them?
Right. That's exactly the question, right? If they're not a stakeholder, if there's not the social mobility and the access to opportunity within the current system, why would you sit idly by and simply allow the system to continue? And that's one of the things that worries me in terms of the total hollowing out of the middle class, the shrinking of the middle class. Like, it's the middle class is that small holding, propertied class that really keeps things in the center, that doesn't really want to go too far one way or the other. It's that good solid middle that you want to keep. I think Danny was quite spot on when he, especially because we travel quite a bit and of course I study politics, and what passes for they're left wingers in America. People in other countries just laugh at that. Like they view the left wing in Washington, in the United States, as basically right wingers in any other European country, for example. Mm-hmm. Like the idea that universal healthcare or something is like radical communist socialism, like they laugh at that. That's so centrist and mainstream. Like you couldn't even run opposing something like that. So.
Have you ever read the book The Strange Death of Marxism?
No.
It's by Paul Gottfried, who
you mentioned
was a
him.
writer for he was a writer for Chronicle magazine. He still is a writer for Chronicle magazine. And basically, I think you would enjoy his books. He's a paleo conservative. He's a paleo conservative in the same vein as someone like Sam Francis. But basically he writes that we live in a post-Marxist society. Marxism was effectively stomped out, was in the West, it was essentially stomped out, and it turned into the class reductionist part of Marxism was, slowly turned into something, into more identity related politics based off race. And now, over the past 10 years or so, like sexual orientation and things like that. But Marxism, for all intents and purposes, doesn't really exist anywhere anymore on this planet. I mean, China's not Marxist. I mean, you're China. You wrote a book on China. Like, is China, like, can you consider China a Marxist state? Like, is it, like, it's, they may say they're, I mean, can you reasonably say that China is a Marxist state?
I don't even know what that would mean, right? Like a state set up on the basis of, worker
communist
communes
state, rather.
Socialism. No, they're not. And I think that Xi Jinping and his predecessors made a wise decision to increasingly try and fuse elements of Marxist dialectic with Confucian and Chinese nationalist rhetoric. It is far more motivating. It's far more powerful, and it speaks to people on a very deep level in a way that just raw ideology doesn't. In the same way that religion, religious faith was deeply undermined by the experience of the scientific revelations and revolutions of the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries, so ideology was largely slain during the course of the 20th century. These horrifying wars and gulags and mass famines that were conducted, and that on the basis of ideology. I mean, crass materialism is what largely motivates people now, and pursuit of power generally under any guise. If you follow Chinese politics, you'll know that it's essentially whatever color cat gets the mouse. Yes, it's true that Xi has increasingly centralized authority and is trying to get more control over the tech sector and things of that nature. But I mean, the same thing is true here in the United States, right? It's not a question of being Marxist or something like that. It's a question of state power. The 20th century was the century of statism, and in the 1990s, with the end of the Cold War, it looked like there was a chance for something different to emerge from it. And because of the choices that were made over that period, approximately 1989 to the present, that isn't what happened. Instead, there's going to be more confrontation. And if there's going to be confrontation, there's going to need to be a stronger state. The state is going to seek to control more elements of society. And so the old liberalism is completely dead. It's been dead for 100 years. Even if you look at things like quote unquote neoliberalism, a term that I hate because it is so unscholastic, it's just impossible to really get a good concrete definition of it. Usually what people mean are the policies roughly pursued by people like Reagan and Thatcher. They weren't calling for the abolition of the central banks, though. They weren't, free trade. Free trade. You could write a free trade agreement on a bar napkin. It would say no quotas, no tariffs, no subsidies. And you sign right here. That's not what free trade agreements look like, though, is it? They run thousands and thousands of pages long because it's actually a bunch of exemptions and protections for various politically connected industries. And a lot of times the exemptions are going to happen. The interventions are going to happen in the economy on the basis of quote unquote national security. No, I mean, I don't know that there is such a thing as, a state that is actively seeking to lessen its own power. It is the very nature of the state to seek to agglomerate more power to itself. And it's really up to an informed and active participatory citizenry to keep that from happening. And I think that is a good explanation of why we wound up where we are today.
Well, I think we can end it there. Danny, do you want to add anything?
I'll just say, I think we've been having kind of a bummer conversation, especially towards the back half of this one. And I don't think it's a coincidence that I don't have children that makes me a serial optimist. I fully recognize that those who have, children are probably seeing the world through slightly different colored glasses than I do. But truly, though, while we definitely have a lot of challenges, I think there's a lot of hope and a lot of optimism, specifically on the technology front, that I think is going to force change upon our politics and upon our lives in general. Some of it's going to be very painful, and people generally don't like change, but it's coming, and I think we need to adopt a measure of
pick yourself
optimism.
up by your bootstraps and work harder. Oh, who's the conservative now?
Not particularly, no. I think we need to adopt a modicum of optimism around this, because while there's a equal amount of things that can go wrong, I think there's on the opposite end of the spectrum, there's plenty that can go right. And we need only to look at our history, specifically. I think a good example would be around the Industrial Revolution, to see how much globally our society, as humanity, has advanced due to these technological changes, and indeed it comes with a lot of ugly underbellies, but there's just so much. I'm happy that I live in this time and not in the 1700s, for so many reasons, and perhaps that's what drives me away from conservative values, because I'm always looking forward. I'm a bit more progressive in that respect, but take it as it is. Doesn't all have to be a bummer. I think we'll figure it out. We're smart.
Yeah, I know. There's no reason you don't resort to nihilism and escapism. That's the last thing you want to do. At the end of the day, you're responsible for yourself and your family. So, yeah, my advice is just you gotta control what's near you and figure out ways to navigate this crazy, complex world. At least we're not living in the 19th century or 20th century Europe where there's genocidal governments going around killing everyone in your town. So, I mean, we're not living in those conditions, which is a positive. Political friction doesn't mean, oh, they're going into this town and they're killing all the Serbians. That's we don't live in that world yet.
Yeah,
but,
and by any number of metrics, things are great, and that's part of what just kind of bums me out. Is like I get that I'm speaking from a perspective of some pretty great privileges, pretty great perks here, sitting where I am. That like life is great, could hardly be better. Can't believe more people aren't enjoying life, and so it kind of is unsettling to see just how bad things are for other people. Because on a personal level, I'm nothing but optimistic about, my future and my children's future. But the fact that, there are so many people getting left behind and who don't seem to be appreciative of the progressive changes that society has made. And the understandably, some things have been lost along the way. But I mean, my goodness, would you really want to go back and live in Europe in the, first decades of the 20th century? You really want to go back and live in the 1700s? Like, are you crazy? Of course not. So yeah, I wish more people were appreciative of the tremendous progress that's been made and the incredible possibilities that could await us if we're patient and pragmatic and willing to accept that things need to change. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, I think we could talk for another couple hours because now I want to talk about the world before what's the first chapter of Eric Hobsbawm's Age of Revolution, the world before 1780.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
now I
just want to talk.
I kind of want to talk back 1790. The world basically before the Industrial Revolution. Now I just want to trace pre-industrial society to where we are now, but I feel like we're not going to be able to do that in 10 minutes. So maybe we'll save that for another time. But thanks everyone for listening to another episode of Bro History. This episode did cover a lot of ground. Initially, we were talking about left versus right-wing politics, but of course, these conversations evolve, and that's a sign of a productive conversation. So hope you enjoyed it. Make sure that you rate and review the podcast. That is the number one way to support our show. You can also subscribe to us on Patreon. And don't let the world grind you down. If things seem hopeless, remember that there's always things that you can do and to alleviate your situation. And there's always good things going on in your life as well. So even though sometimes things are a bummer, the state of the world can be harsh and there is a lot of uncertainty. Don't dwell on politics all day because that's not productive and, it will drive you mad in the long run. So enjoy your day, enjoy your week, and we'll see you next week, maybe with a question mark, but definitely the week after next week. Peace. And the motorcycle.